Welcome back to Highly Respected. I'm your host, Scott Greer. Today, I'm joined once again by Hans Lander of the Myth of the 20th Century podcast. Hans, how are you?
I'm good. I just entered the coffee zone. I'm coming for your Nightmare Vision. I'm coming
All
for
right.
that title of most frequent guest.
Is MIA. I've been trying to look all over the woods of New England for him. I keep doing my owl call. I can't find him. I've even tried to use anti-woke leftist women to lure him out of the woods, but even that won't work. It's very mysterious. Nightmare, if you're out there, please call us. We want to hear from you. We want to make sure you're okay. But I digress. If Nightmare Vision just wants to stay in hiding, that's his right to do that.
Yeah, maybe we can get the Red Scare girls to coax him out of wherever he is.
Yeah, Enrique Chan will release another peep.
Some lascivious Dasha pics will get him back on the show.
We'll see if we can do that with Nightmare. But we've got a jam-packed episode, totally free of Nightmare Vision today. First up, of course, the Cuties controversy. That's all that conservatives wanted to talk about last week, and for good reason. For those who don't know, Netflix released the French film Cuties, which I am not going to even attempt to pronounce it in French. It's not Cuties in French. They released it last week to the disgust of most Americans. The film features 11-year-old girls in skimpy outfits doing sexualized dances. Politicians now want to investigate Netflix for distributing possible child porn. Hans, what's your take on this?
Well, how long ago was it that we were all joking? Inevitably, there will be the article in National Review, the conservative case for child pornography, or the conservative case for decriminalizing pedophilia. We used to use that as a joke to make fun of these people 4, 5, maybe even 6 years ago. And now we are maybe only 4 or 5 months out from getting the eponymous National Review take or Reason Mag take on why we ought to just allow child pornography in feature films under the guise, of course, of being against child pornography, which is the strange thing. I think I've said this to a couple of people already, but what's really shocking to me about this, what I think is lost in a lot of the conversation, this is a French film. A lot of people think it's an American film. I have not seen it, although my understanding is that there are several lengthy scenes where all the characters are speaking English in the film. So it's confusing to those who maybe saw the clips and thought, "Oh, this is American. There's Americans making this."
I think it's really bad. Just to briefly, I think it's really bad. I've watched some of the clips, and it's really bad dubbing. It almost looks like an Asian, one of those. Old Jackie Chan movies of the dubbing. It's the mouth is definitely not moving along, and the voices do not look like the characters. And it's really, I don't know why you would watch the film in dubbing, but it continues.
Well, I think regardless, then I think a lot of people had the conception this was an American film, and it's a French thing. It's a French project. All the producers are French. The director is a Senegalese French emigre female. Very convenient patsy for what they're trying to do here. And of course, I saw that she was, of course, complaining that she's been getting death threats, which is, understandable. And she was attempting to reiterate this position that my film is about showing the exploitation of children. But and again, I have not seen it, but according to people who have, there are many scenes that go on way too long and are shot in a way that is very clearly sexualized. It would have been one thing to shoot the film in a dark, grimy ambiance that, with horrifying music slowly creeping up in the back. I'm thinking of some of the scenes in David Fincher's Girl with the Dragon Tattoo movie.
Yeah.
But instead, the film is shot with bright colors in broad daylight with upbeat music. So unless there's some intense meta level irony here, which I don't even know why you would do when you're talking about child exploitation, why do you need to be ironic? It's a very disturbing subject on the face of it. I can only conclude that part of the agenda is to actually make you feel sexually attracted to children and then somehow teach you a lesson after doing so. It's very peculiar. I really don't understand why conservatives are deciding this is the hill to die on, why Ben Shapiro has decided this is the hill I want to die on. But clearly something about this film is a great filter. It's filtering out who is a terrible person and who is a sycophant and then who has some level of moral righteousness and thinks this is just horrifyingly disgusting, regardless of kind of what the intention of the film is purported to be.
Yeah, I agree with most of what you said. The one thing I would push back on is that this represents like the coming wave of National Review articles, the conservative case for child pornography. Actually, I think it represents a doubling down on the taboo of pedophilia. And the way that liberals are defending this movie, like Reason wrote a defense of it because it's like that. Because the main reason they see this is like, this is a film about female empowerment and women finding their own sexuality. I mean, they're clearly not women. They're 11 years old. And in the film, these girls act like horny male teenagers. Like they're constantly trying to like get dick pics of like young men. They're very sexually aggressive and they're for like 11 years old. And the movie celebrates this, even though what liberals are saying in defense of the movie is like, well, the movie criticizes the exploitation of these girls and it's bemoaning the horrible effect that these beauty pageants or whatever have on them. At the same time, they're still in skin tight outfits, grinding and twerking up there. And the movie is like seeing this as like playing it for humor, that like we have these little girls doing something that we would normally associate with women who are 10 years older than them,
Who finds this humorous is who I really want to find out. Like, who is sitting back and laughing?
Yeah, the film is not, as you were saying, putting this as a David Fincher, style film where it's like dark industrial music playing and there's like dark thing, and they're not, focused in on these young girls' bodies, which the film is doing. It's playing it as like lighthearted humor, and at the end of the day, it's like, well, this is bad because they're exploiting the girls, but it's good that these women are finding girls are finding their sexuality 11, and this is a girl power message. So that's what they're defending the movie as, which that's still a negative message. Even if that were true, it's still a negative message. There were some people on the right who wanted to be contrarians. There's some people who really strive to be the ultimate contrarian out there. And they were saying like, oh, this movie's like Wellebeck. It's actually a critique of liberal modernity. And they're actually siding with the Muslims, because the main character in the movie is, a West African Muslim immigrant whose family is very devoutly Islamic, or they're devoted Muslims, and they do not approve of their daughter's actions. But they're the bad guys in the movie. The good guys, or what the good theme is this girl assimilating into degenerate Western culture and like grinding up on stage. That's the good thing. It's the Islamic family, the devoted Islamic family are the bad guys because they're closed-minded and bigoted and they don't understand the modern world and they want to suppress their poor daughter from empowering herself. So that argument is stupid and doesn't make sense. And
I think the argument that we're talking about female empowerment, like you said, for 11-year-olds, or women empowering women. Growing up, I don't think I ever heard any of the adults in my life, and maybe I was just too privileged or whatever, say to an 11-year-old or even a 13-year-old, like, you're a woman. It was always like young lady, right? Or something like that. Like there was a clear understanding, okay, you're not really a woman yet. Like whenever you become a woman, 18, 21, it doesn't matter. Clearly you're not there yet. And so the idea that female empowerment now applies to women of any age, I think is the really, really damning conceit of all this. So the director and all these shady frog producers really want to make this message that it's both about empowerment and exploitation at the same time, which is bizarre. But they're basically saying that women of any age can be empowered. And even right there, you know, women of any age, you know, don't we say like you're a child before you're really a woman? Like, don't we agree that there's that clear delineation of time and maturity that is kind of important? But what they're getting at is that it doesn't exist, and that the second you're born, and if you're female when you're born, or if your parents have a gender reveal party and say you're female, I guess, then from that moment on, even before you're 1 year old, you are supposed to be empowered as a woman. So
Yeah.
the whole message of it is truly pernicious and really sick. And I think that the French, or the director, quote unquote, is just some dumb African. Like, she doesn't actually know what she's talking about. She's been given a script. I actually partially believe that she didn't make the movie. Apparently she's a first-time director. Like, I just refuse to believe that she made this film.
Yeah, it was some weirdo French
fraud. Yeah, I think she's
like, le pedophilia movie.
Yeah, I think she's a patsy, and I really doubt that she had a heavy hand in making the film. I don't think she wrote the film, so that's also a part of it. But you know, at the end of the day, it was a brilliant move for the French, and I think this film is really a bigger indictment of anything. If you're going to indict anything of French culture, clearly France in the cities is just completely gone. Just judging by what I've seen out of the film, most of the characters are clearly not French, not white. It's very disturbing to see France basically emulating America, the American inner city life, in all but name. I think even one of the characters I saw had like a shirt on it, said New York or something like that. Like, it's very bizarre. And it's very bizarre that no one in France is standing up to this. I mean, at least here in the United States, we have US senators who are listening to their base, who are very, very disgusted. And, you know, talking about dragging Netflix, Reed Hastings, up to the Capitol Hill for questioning.
Or even arresting him. You know,
yeah,
some people
whether or not they're serious, doesn't matter. The fact that they would come out and publicly say that means that there's, I think, widespread disgust at this. And in France, I have not seen any major complaints. I have not seen anything from the French Catholic Church. I have not seen anything from the UMP. I've not seen anything from any major French political figures or cultural figures. It seems to be just passive acceptance, if not total embracement of whatever this film is supposed to be. And I think the French, as always, have a way of rationalizing things that really don't need to be rationalized, especially kind of post-continental philosophical France. Post Foucault, the French really have a way of rationalizing just about anything.
Yeah, and there were a bunch of weird French, I mean, as you mentioned, Foucault and others, who, as like a way of like really tackling traditional mores, they really wanted to lower the age of consent and basically say, what's wrong with pedophilia? This is a big thing in like the 70s and 80s. And it's not just France, it's a particular like European thing. Like, people just want to say like, this is Hollywood promoting this on this. It's like, this type of movie could never be made in Hollywood. Like, no, I mean, Americans have way too much revulsion towards pedophilia. And I want to get to that in a moment, but back on the European thing is that the German Green Party in the 80s was openly advocating for the legalization of pedophilia. And the German Green Party is the second biggest party right now, and it's always been a big party, and they had to apologize for their pro-pedophilia stances. As you know, it's an always good political move when you have to apologize for being previously pro-pedophilia. And they were, because this was like the hot new thing of the left in the 70s and 80s in Europe, that like, oh, we're rejecting all forms of traditional bourgeois morality, so we're going to start banging kids. And like, people are like, what? Wait, what? Wait, what are you doing? And that was, unfortunately, you know, that type of mentality on the left has been in decline in Europe. Even though we're seeing this with, you know, the Cuties, I think some of the muted French reaction was due to the different marketing campaign. What really made Cuties a big thing in America is that Netflix put out this horrifying image of these girls in skin tight outfits looking like they're coming from like a rap music video, and they're 11 years old. It's a clearly sexualized image. And a lot of the liberals tried to say, well, this movie's not bad. It's just this bad marketing campaign. And in France, the marketing campaign showed them as like normal kids. And I guess it's like a, you know, as like an art house film, or not necessarily an art house film, but it's not necessarily like a blockbuster movie. Like most French probably weren't aware of what this movie was saying. And they're just like, oh, it's a normal movie. Like whatever. They didn't have this marketing campaign that immediately caused a controversy there. So that's one point. But there is like a greater, you know, in Europe, there is a greater tolerance for this type of stuff versus America. Actually, I think, and, you know, go back to your previous point saying that this does represent a growing or somewhat slippery slope down to normalizing pedophilia. Actually, as I was saying, I rather disagree with that. I think, surprisingly, Michael Brennan Doherty of National Review, who usually has a lot of cringe takes and is always trying to find reasons to say that he's not a racist or anything, and not an extremist, actually had a very good point about this. This is a reply to Quillet's Claire Lehman, who was trying to say that the pedophilia obsession is another moral panic, like the satanic ritual abuse of the 1980s. Very stupid point, but Doherty had a good retort. He said, my view is that throughout my life, the good taboo against sexual contact with minors and children has been dramatically strengthened, but the taboos protecting the innocence of childhood have been dismantled. I think that's 100% on point. We have, like, you know, there's a greater degree of sexualization of the 12-year-olds, but there is a more horror to adults, you know, initiating sexual contact with them than at any point. I mean, you have to look throughout our history is that it would have been quite normal for a 30-year-old man to marry a 14-year-old or a 13-year-old throughout most of European history. Thankfully, that's not the case anymore. Actually, throughout not even European history, throughout human history. You know, in America, people will be like, what the hell is that? And there were several famous people throughout. I think Elvis Presley had a, you know, minor girlfriend. Some of the other rock and roll stars also were marrying women, definitely not of the age of consent. You know, that type of behavior would no longer be accepted now. And I think, rather to Clara Lehman's point, saying that, like, oh, there's a huge moral panic about pedophilia. The real thing about pedophilia is it's the only thing in our society we're allowed to be revolted by. Everything else,
there's nothing else left.
60 years ago, everything 60 years ago that people would have been repulsed by, homosexuality, transgender, gay couples raising kids, you know, even stuff like interracial couples, anything that would have been revolting to us, or even like morbidly obese people, you know, you can't be revolted by that anymore. All of these things that, you know, 60 years ago, our grandparents would have been like, yuck, what is this? I'm outraged. That's no longer tolerated. The only thing you're allowed to be repulsed by is pedophilia. And that's why there's a greater concern for it now than at any point, because all of our moral indignation that was like, you know, normal opposition to a lot of these traits, you know, within a lot of people's lifetime is now just directed towards pedophilia. And that's why people are so concerned with it, is they're not allowed to even say, you know, misgender, transgender people anymore. They're not allowed to say, I oppose gay marriage. They're not allowed to say, I oppose gays raising kids. But they are gay couples raising kids. All of that.
You see the left is trying to, like, capitalize on, I think, a renewed interest in preventing pedophilia. And they're trying to swing it into just large differences in age when dating.
Yes,
which is very,
and it's women. This is just with women. It's primarily driven by aging awfuls who are realizing that the guys that they desire are dating 23-year-olds. So there's all this outrage at Leonardo DiCaprio, who always dumps his girl at like 25 or 20 or maybe even 23. They're all outraged by that. I mean, let Leonardo DiCaprio, he probably should settle down and marry and have kids, but that's another concern. But they're very angry at people like Zach Braff, who has like a 23-year-old girlfriend, and they're like, he is so awful. He's in his 40s. He needs to be dating a 40-year-old woman, you know, and they're mad at him for that. They were even mad at Elon Musk calling him a pedophile because his like girlfriend or his wife rather, is 28 and is short, and thus he's attracted to kids because his wife is like 25 years younger than him. Or
but you know that these people would immediately try and rationalize as some like disgusting fiend was crying about how he cannot avoid his attraction to young children. They'd say, well, we need to find treatments for this poor man, and we need to understand where he's coming from. I mean, there have been editorials in the New York Times and so forth about trying to rationalize and understand pedophilia, as if it's something to understand. And that these people are doing this completely out of cynical self-belief in their own moral superiority, and that they should be the ones to judge whether or not someone is a pedophile or not. And so you're definitely a pedophile if you're 40-year-old dating a girl who's like 23 or 24, but you're probably not a bad guy, even if you're a self-admitted pedophile and you're a 40-year-old who's really into 9-year-old girls. Like, that's something we ought to understand and not immediately criticize. That's how these people try and frame the argument back and forth. And I think that it's probably going to wind up going one of two ways. One, they could be successful in that they become sort of the pure arbiters on the morality of this stuff. Or it goes the other way, and I think that there's sort of across the board realization that pedophilia is a growing issue in the United States for one reason or another, and we need to sit down and think about how do we put an end to this, completely. Do we strengthen the laws? Do we go after people? Do we devote more resources to that kind of to catch a predator style thing, where we lure these guys? What is it? And I think the same probably goes for all those, middle school and high school teachers in their 20s who are banging like 13-year-old boys left and right. Which
our society treats as like a joke. I mean, like that.
Right.
I mean, which I actually think rightfully so. I mean, it's like a 16. First off, every time those 15-year-olds like interviewed them, and they're like, "Hell yeah, I banged my English teacher." None of them are like, "This is a victim." And there's so many rock songs about like having sex with a teacher that there is. I actually kind of support this because everyone's like, "What about the double standard?" It's like there's clearly something different from your creepy 40-year-old math teacher having sex with a 14-year-old girl versus like your hot like English teacher having sex with a 16-year-old. Of course, she should be fired and face prosecution. But like the moral opprobrium, where no one is ever going to be that upset about it. It's like something funny and a joke, and it also shows the problem of hot teachers teaching high schoolers, which they probably shouldn't do.
Well, it shows another problem in that these are the same awfuls who are probably, complaining about Henry Cavill dating a 19-year-old, but are, immediately trying to seduce and groom a 14-year-old boy to be like their sex slave. I mean, yeah, I think what it really boils down to, and what Cuties and all of this boils down to, is that in America and in the West broadly, and it's on a different spectrum wherever you go. It's going to be different in rural Indiana versus Paris, France, but broadly there seems to be a decline in just sort of basic sexual mores, and everything is becoming a free-for-all. Along with, apparently the rates of sexlessness are shooting through the roof. So you have both the collapse in sexual mores and a lot of people who are just not having sex anymore. It's
the rise of the incel is real, folks.
It's very, very troubling, and I think that it's probably going to get worse as you see more condoning of pedophilia and grooming and attempts to rationalize it. You're also going to see a lot of people that I think are normal, have normal ideas, and are kind of pushed out of the dating market entirely.
Yeah, and I think it is the liberal media does want to rationalize it to such a extent, but every time they do, it generates a tremendous outrage because most of America, like if you'd said stuff like castrate pedophiles now, like Probably 70% of the country agrees with that. Like, we are there. Most of this country is not about to normalize pedophilia. And the right knows that it's gives them a type of moral power that other arguments don't. It's like everyone wants to save the kids. Like when QAnon has like Save Our Children rallies and the left complains about it, it's like, do you not want to save our kids from the pedophile cabals? What type are you a pedophile defender? You know, it does give them moral ammunition that they otherwise wouldn't have. So
well, it's also interesting that these people are still very afraid of being branded as pedophiles. I think that they know that a lot of people instinctually are pretty.
People want to go out and kill like pedophiles. Like, I would be very worried. Like, there's like all these. I mean, even on the right, you know, there's all these right-wing memes, which they're kind of. I really don't like people like, you know, boasting of phony violence of any kind of like, and them trying to act tough. And it's like they'll like have posts like kill your local pedophile. I mean, none of these idiots are going to do that. But if you are somebody who's like accused of being a pedophile and you see all of these like normal Americans like sharing like kill your local pedophile and celebrating like fathers who go down and gun down their child, you know, the guy who molested their kid and stuff, like, you would be pretty worried about that. I mean, that's not a moral judgment. It's just saying that people don't want to be branded as pedophiles. And the left is very, you know, concerned with this. And even with this Cuties things, they decided they wanted to defend it because they saw this movie as not as, you know, normalizing the sexualization of children or normalizing pedophilia. Rather, they saw it as like, this is a female empowerment movie and these dumbass rubes are attacking it, so we have to defend it. And they're just saying like, oh, they're just worried about QAnon, like complaining about Cuties is connected to QAnon. But they weren't necessarily defending it on the grounds that we should be more understanding of pedophiles, because they know that this generates extreme outrage in our country. As I was saying before, it's the only taboo that's still allowed. And, you know, that's how they're going to have to deal with. Actually, I said we're going to not have any more mentions of Nightmare Vision, but he had a great tweet about how the left treats pedophilia. I want to put out here is this. He said, new Democrat Party platform. We will outlaw any sexual relationship with a woman between the ages of 11 and 30, but any time before and after is okay. That's
literally like what these people are trying to
absolutely what they want. It's like, if you like, you're still a child till you're like 30, and then when you're 31, like every man should be demanding to date you. And like you can date like an 18-year-old if you're a woman at that time, or you can date whoever you want. But before you're 30, you know, if you're in your 20s and there's older guys who want to date you, that's child molestation. And they have these like silly arguments for that. So that's another thing, is that the left also wants the moral scorn to exist for pedophilia, so these women can defend their sexual market value as they get older. And if they don't have the moral power of accusing older men who are dating like women in their 20s of pedophilia, that, you know, negates their sexual market value. That takes away their most powerful weapon to browbeat these older men into dating them.
And there's plenty of like guys, like these weird DSA types I've seen who are in their 20s, or I don't know, they might be in their 20s, but they strike me as, you know, guys in their 20s. And they're also pissed off about it, but you can tell why, because these dudes are like total losers and they don't really date much to begin with. But they see it as like these older dudes are taking all the women and are attracting all the women our age, and this is, you know, totally wrong, and this is part of patriarchy and all this sort of bizarre stuff. I think there's a lot of envy from both sexes going on here, and there's a lot of older awfuls, like you say, and there's a lot of guys and these like weird beta types in their 20s who are really incensed about it, because I think that they maybe there's some justification there, I don't know, but there's quite a bit of envy around why are older men allowed to date women our age? And because they have more money, they have more success, they have more experience, so obviously women are going to be attracted to them. They're not attracted to us. And they always frame it in, I think, somewhat earnestly. They frame it in like class warfare terms, you know, like it's because we don't have any money. Our generation has no money. Women aren't interested in us anymore. And it's like, okay, yeah, I can go along with that kind of. And then it turns into like, by the way, if you're Henry Cavill and you're dating a 21-year-old, you're a pedophile. It's like, okay, well,
it's the woke version of inceldom. You know,
yes,
they're complaining about
yeah.
Chad, but they're making it woke and politically correct.
Right.
And a lot of them do make this remarks. I think there was like some crappy left-wing journalist. I think his name is like Luke O'Neill. He's like one of these guys who writes stupid freelance articles and they somehow make a living. And he one time insulted Glenn Greenwald, even though Glenn Greenwald's husband may not have been of age of consent when they started the relationship. You know, I'm not sure the story behind that, but they always insult Glenn Greenwald about that. And then this guy bragged about, hey, he's like, my wife is the exact same age. Can you say the same? And I was like, how is it a bragging point that your like wife is the same age as you? And it's like, but that's what they want is like the bragging point is like, at least I date women my age. And it's like, okay,
good for you.
Yeah, it's like, I'm not sure what the argument here is, but I think the conclusion point with like Cuties is that it's like a white pill, is that Americans will get outraged and will take action against things that they perceive as normalizing pedophilia, which has a very good thing, but it is a result of us not being allowed to show any disdain or disgust for behaviors that our grandparents would have been revolted by. So there's a difference. I think we're going to see much more of these Cuties like scandals, and I don't think Hollywood and the entertainment industry really wants to oppose on this. Like Netflix is taking a hit from this, both from in their public capital, and they're standing among the public somewhat with financially. I mean, their stocks are going down, and there were significant level of cancellations. I mean, they're not going to go under because of this, but they are taking a hit from this, and they don't really like the negative publicity of being the pro-pedophile company. And I think more, companies are going to be aware of these problems and not try to put out movies that sexualize children. So I think this is generally a good thing. It's very good that conservatives are standing up for it, but it's ultimately a result of not being allowed to condemn other behaviors.
Well, I think that Netflix has always tried to associate itself with content, whether or not they're producing it themselves or not, that is sexually transgressive. So for a long time, I don't know if it's still on or not. I do not care. But there was that show, Orange is the New Black, on Netflix, and
Awfuls love that show.
Yes, and chiefly because it's basically about an awful goes to prison, and for something like minor, I think I watched like 2 or 3 episodes.
I think she like drug traffics for her lesbian lover.
Yes.
And then she goes in and she makes friends with all the non-whites in jail, and it's just an awful. It's really like an awful fantasy. It's like, oh, this girl's so quirky and nerdy, but all the black women love her, and it's like how they imagine. It's how awfuls imagine that they would be in jail.
Yeah, well. Regardless, like that was like a very sexually transgressive piece of content, and I think I saw 2 or 3 episodes, and just on trying to figure out what it was when it came out, and was immediately kind of repulsed. But it was all about like lesbian relationships, interracial lesbian relationships, doing this, doing that, like the Eastern Europe, like trying to justify Eastern European male bride scenarios. It was just like, okay. So that was 4 or 5 years ago, maybe 6 years ago when that came out. And so you can see the slippery slope in real time. So now we have, borderline child pornography, if not just straight up child pornography on Netflix. I mean, you can go and you can watch what is effectively child pornography. Like if that was filmed with like a camcorder in some, Southeast Asian shithole like the Philippines, if you had that exact kind of footage on your computer, the feds would bust in the door, drag you off to prison. But instead, it's on Netflix, and you can basically watch the equivalent of that for the low price of whatever it is, $9 a month, and that's totally fine. So it's only taken 6 years for us to go from lesbian relationships with adults in prison to child pornography.
Yeah.
It's like people always say, oh, the slippery slope. And a lot of these conservative types have been engaging in that sort of rhetoric. And it's like, well, it's very clear. It's on this platform. You can see the slippery slope. You can see the transgression from, lesbianism, which I think for a long time people were like, yeah, it's just adults. It's just women doing their thing. Like, what's the big deal? And now it's okay. Now we're looking at 11-year-olds engaging in basically similar behavior. Like, at what point are we going to say, hey, the slippery slope is real. Maybe we should have some content guidelines, and we should try and limit what exactly we expose the world to. But
yeah, and going along with that point is the summer's big hit that we talked about earlier on an earlier episode of Cardi B's WAP is like one of the biggest hits right now, and the entire song would have never even been allowed on near any radio station, probably even 5 years ago. I mean, certainly not 10 or 20 years ago. And as we've already talked about, it's a woman, describing her wet ass pussy, or P word, as Ben Shapiro would describe it, and how she wants this man to do all these terrible things to her, consensually, of course. But I know the conservative outburst against that was obviously what made the song popular in political circles was Ben Shapiro's hilarious reading of the lyrics, and then everyone mocking him. And yeah, there was some conservative pushback against it. Tucker Carlson did a segment on it attacking the song and how it's degenerate, and primarily preteen girls, like 11-year-old girls, are going to listen to the song and do the dance, the WAP dance. And there's already several clips.
Kellyanne Conway's daughter is doing
it. Who's 15 years old. Yeah, 15 years old, was doing the dance. And there's several other TikTok videos of girls in the high school doing the dance. And it's not even like a dance. It's just like mimicking sex. I mean, because they're just like humping the ground, and then they're doing all these other things that it's not even even a dance anymore. It's just mimicking sex and by yourself.
Well, I think that someone was like, I can't remember where I saw this, but there was a string of like a compilation of women doing this. And there's a lot of these women who are clearly home from college due to COVID. They're doing college at home, their family home, which I think is probably driving their poor parents up the wall. And there was this one girl who basically did the dance in front of her parents. And they're like, you can see how they're trying not to cringe because they know they're on camera and they know they're being recorded, but they look it's very painful to watch their reactions.
There's a ton of parent reactions. There's one where there was a shirtless dad who got angry. He's like, stop doing that, please stop. He's like so horrified that his daughter would be doing that. But this is like really, I would actually say WAP's influence is much more pernicious and much more prevalent than Cuties. Well, I think we're all in agreement that conservatives should stop Cuties. It has a terrible message, even if you want to believe that, it's actually anti-child sexual exploitation. Whatever, this movie should be censored. We're all for that. But WAP is far more popular, far more prevalent. And conservatives can only like shake their heads at it and be like, and when Bitchero's segment, he ended with shaking his head. It's like, this isn't about women's empowerment. This is about this is crude and vulgar and demeans women. It has like conservatives' attacks on it were like saying we're the real feminists, not Cardi B. There was a Federalist article that made the same point. Tucker, of course, didn't make that same point. He defended traditional family values and said this song is degenerate. But there's not much they can do about it. They don't want to look like squares. And independent researcher Richard Hanania had actually a very good point. A lot of people, when I retweeted this, got mad that I retweeted this. He said, quote, conservatives would rather fight Cuties than WAP, much more dangerous and popular for the same reasons they'd rather talk about Antifa than BLM. He added in a follow-up tweet, the idea that the promotion of pedophilia is the main problem with pop culture or even the top 100 is delusional. It's just we've gotten used to the other stuff and accept it now. Do you agree with that? I pretty much agree with that. There is like a racial element with people not wanting to go into WAP, and liberal journalists were quick to defend it. Like, this is a celebration of Black female sexuality. And conservatives like, oh, well, I don't want to be called a racist and a misogynist at the same time for being anti-WAP. But this song is going, 11-year-olds are listening to this. They're imitating the dance. The dance is just mimicking sex moves. And this is what the lessons they're learning. And fortunately, not that many preteens are going to watch Cuties. I think the movie's going to be watched primarily by creepy men and like these creepy losers who have neck beards and are DSA and they're trying to, look hip for like they're women who are not going to go on dates with them.
I mean, several people like that have already been indicted for child exploitation, child pornography. There was that fucking freak, Dr. Pizza. He was like a journalist or tech journalist. And he had all these posts on Twitter about like, he was like all this moral grandstanding about pedophilia. And then it turns out he's like grooming a 9-year-old.
Yeah, I remember that.
Horrifying. And so, yes, you're right. Those are the people.
Yeah, and then it's awfuls. It's primarily awfuls who are going to watch it who don't have children and like, oh, I love these girls have spunk. I love them. I wish I had them, but I don't want kids. That's like the primary audience for it. It's not 11-year-olds who are watching this movie and deciding that they want to be like them.
Well, there's the barrier.
11-year-olds are listening to Cardi B and deciding they want to be like Cardi B.
Right.
So it's it's diminishing their innocence. When you were, even when I was growing up, which is not that long ago, some people think I'm an old man. I'm not even 30 yet. You didn't necessarily have, you had Britney Spears and Christina Aguilera, and there was still even pushback against them of what they were like, this is too suggestive. But now that looks like,
wasn't it like Hit Me Baby One More Time? Wasn't that Britney Spears Hit Me Baby?
Yeah, that was like in late 90s. But even that, like compared to Cardi B and even Ariana Grande, it's like the Andrews sisters, it's like something it's almost wholesome in comparison. And this is what goes on in our culture now. I don't even know necessarily what the argument for this is, but conservatives have given up on like regulating the culture. Like the PMRC, as we talked about in an earlier episode, it's not coming back. There is no mechanism for suppressing this. And conservatives don't want to look like squares, especially the young conservatives who populate conservative media, many of whom are listening to WAP and like doing their cycle session with
some of
their
whom
Cardi B playlist. Yeah, and that too. There's no resistance towards it. And I don't know, the conservatives aren't necessarily promoting like an alternative culture here. They're accepting the culture and they're just trying to put like a free market spin on it. I don't know what even the resistance is for it, but you have to develop a cultural war mindset in order to resist this stuff, because otherwise it's just going to get worse. I don't know how much worse it can get than WAP, but we'll see. We could be surprised, but I think that's enough on that subject. I think we've come to a serious, highly respected solution on the problem. But moving on to another well-known Scott M. Greer enemy faction is the Brahmins are in the news. As we all know, I've had some run-ins with Indian nationalists and high caste Indians who really don't like my facts and logic, but
wasn't there a congressman on your ass? Wasn't it Ro Khanna?
Yeah, Ro Khanna was getting mad at me for calling him out for wanting more Indian immigration and serving corporate interests, and he was like saying like, "Oh well, Trump supports this." It's like, I don't care. Like, this is bad. But so Indians, we're still at a war. Trying to reach a ceasefire, but there is a great article that is showing the mainstream media is noticing this. It was by Razib Khan. Razib Khan actually, I think a few years ago, got a job at the New York Times, but he had written that some stuff about human biodiversity, and of course he was let go, and he himself is Indian. He writes a lot of good stuff. I follow him on Twitter. He had a whole article for Unheard, which publishes a lot of interesting article called How Brahmins Lead the Fight Against White Privilege. It's a very good article showing how most of the Indians who are here are from the high caste. They've suffered no discrimination throughout their life. They were privileged back in India. They're privileged here in America because their parents are middle to upper class. They're living in the suburbs. White people really don't have any racial animus against them. And yet they are the loudest critics of white supremacy and the loudest people saying like, I've been oppressed. I've been discriminated against. The Kumail Nanjiani guy, who famous comedian, comic actor, was on Andrew Yang this week and complaining about how he's suffered so much discrimination in America and it's been so bad for him here. And his mom from Pakistan is here and she's whining about how she doesn't feel welcome and she may need to go back. And I'm like, no, you don't face this at all. Like, Asian Americans are desperate for this. But this article goes into like how the leaders in the fight, he particularly highlights Sarah Rao, who unfortunately blocked me, even though we shared a same opposition towards elite white women.
I thought you guys were like really close allies or something.
Yeah, she followed me for briefly, but she unfollowed me, then blocked me. So
Top
hopefully
10
she'll unblock me.
betrayals right there.
Very true top 10 anime betrayals. For those that don't know, Sarah Rao is a failed congressional candidate who always does stuff about how like white women need to like have their speaking rights taken away, which is good, and also complaining about white supremacy 24/7. Even though she grew up in a wealthy suburb of Richmond, Virginia. Went to, I believe,
Colorado or something like that.
Yeah, I think she went to the University of Virginia Law School, clerked for a federal judge. She's had every privilege in the world, but and I think her husband's a millionaire as well.
Yeah, I looked into her husband. He's kind of a shady banker type. He was involved in some very odd bankruptcy proceedings down in Louisiana and other places. And it's been a while since I've looked into this, but he seems like a real dick. So yeah.
And so to go back to this article, the article makes the point that Brahmins, high caste Indians, and other South Asians are the ones leading all these social justice causes, and they're the wealthiest ethnic group in America. When you look at the leadership of all these groups, he points out various leaders and other people who are involved in democratic politics who are of Indian background. And it's like they're the ones who are leaders. He even makes a point that's saying that they're almost like the new Jews in our society, where they're very wealthy demographic who feel alienated from the typical middle American mainstream, and they want to change it. So it is good that we're now noticing that, the Brahmin menace, which other people have not noticed before. I'm hoping that more mainstream media attention is paid to this. What do you think of this?
Well, look, you mentioned Jews. I mean, it goes back to this, the country club phenomena, right? Where, one of the funnier theories about why I think Jews in America, in many respects, became purposeful social outcasts who then push for social change all the time, was because they were rejected from the local country club. And you can kind of see the same thing, that same mentality with a lot of these Brahmins. Now, those country
But I would argue they haven't been rejected.
No. Yeah, I was going to say,
yeah,
the country clubs don't even exist anymore. So there is no clique. Like they're making it up. They're basically imagining oppression for both cynical, self-fulfilling reasons, and I think some level of mental illness, that they want to believe that there is this clique of like this white cabal that they have to get in on, that they have to break up. The reality is, if there's any white cabal left in America, it's like actively trying to screw over people in rural Indiana. It's not trying to like institute the Fourth Reich. And it's very clear also that, again, they're doing it for cynical reasons. They have to. They are very good social climbers. I think recently there were comments released from the Richard Nixon Foundation on statements that both Richard Nixon and Dr.
Henry Kissinger made about Indians.
Dr. Henry Kissinger made about Indians. And, Nixon was like, I don't know how they reproduce, Henry. Goddamn ethnics. and Kissinger was like, what did he say? It's like, they're scavenging people.
Like...
They survived for 800 years by sucking up to everyone. And it was probably the greatest observation of Indians I've ever heard, that they're scavengers and they suck up, and that's how they survive. That's how they survived the Mughal Empire. That's how they survived the British Raj. That's how they survived everything. They suck up. They're really a failed civilization that is kind of sucking up to foreign rulers all the time, and that's what they'll do. They will social climb. They will suck up, and they are very good at observing that in this country, there's a real problem with I don't know how to frame it. basically that there's a lot of people that will do whatever it takes to get ahead socially.
Yeah, they're ruthless climbers, and that is very true if you ever meet any of them. They will do anything, and they'll change a lot of even their political beliefs in order to meet that requirement to move up. And even though they complain about white supremacy and the white privilege and all these terrible things that are happening in our society, they are sucking up to the white elite, liberal elite, or liberal white elite that they want to join in and be a part of. And any Indian that I've ever met is, all the time they're spending their time with whites, they're dating whites, that's all that they want to be with. But yet they're not really forming their own, necessarily their own subculture within society, even though they are very clannish. It's not like they're, they are very open to the idea of mixing and mating with whites, which isn't the same with other groups. Like every Indian I've ever met is dating a white person, like male or female. Like it's like very rare to meet. It's like an Indian person with an Indian significant other. It's very rare to see. I even would say that even among East Asians, you would see lower outgroup partnering than even among Indians. But yet they have a strong sense of Indian identity. Many of them, even when they marry a white person, they insist on giving their child an Indian name. J.D. Vance's child, who is half Indian, has an Indian name. Even a lot of these people who've been like second and third generation Indians still have Indian first names. They're not people giving like their name like, here, you're John Patel. Like they might go by John Patel in business life, but their real first name is something that is Indian. So they very much keep a hold of their cultural ties while mixing with the white liberal elite.
Yeah, and it's really all about just ensuring their own survival. I mean, there's been a lot of discussion from U.S. tech workers, which is kind of a new organization, but they've been doing good work. I think that they're the ones who pushed for the Tennessee Valley Authority changes that Trump made, and they've frequently brought up NASCOM, which is this lobbying organization basically out of New Delhi. And they push for H-1B visas, and they push for high-level recruitment at American companies of Indian executives for the C-suite, for senior management positions, senior engineering positions, product management, so forth. And what they've noted is that there's plenty of evidence coming out now. Not plenty of evidence, stories, documented in some cases, part of lawsuits in some cases, of very, very real and very deep ethnic nepotism and hiring. And
absolutely.
And basically, if your company brings on any of these people into a senior management position, everyone who's not Indian they're cooked. Like they're totally screwed, and it's only a matter of time until they are let go for cost-saving reasons or for something trumped up entirely. And very quickly, either Indians who have successfully immigrated to the United States and have more than just a visa are brought on if they can be. If not, outsourcing, H-1Bs, all of it is employed. And I've seen it happen. I've known people who've been in those situations, and it's pretty brutal. And obviously, there's plenty of inter-ethnic racism in India and Indian society, probably more so than anything you'll find in America. There's lynchings every day, as you've talked about.
Yeah, against the Muslim minority.
Right, but they will forego some manner of that, I think, or a good amount of it, if they know that they can increase their power back in India by, giving away jobs to anyone. And I think it's really about not only ingratiating themselves with the American elite, but it's about reflecting that power back into India. And so they grow in money here. They can also grow their money in India, grow their standing in India. And maybe one day they go back, run for office, do whatever. And it's reminiscent of a lot of the old Sicilian syndicates that used to be powerful in this country. And that not only were they concerned with the dynamics of their power here, they were very concerned with the dynamics of their power, how reflected back in Sicily and in southern Italy. And so that's why, like things like the Ndrangheta were formed after the influence of the American Italian Sicilian mobs kind of flew back into Italy. Then you have the recreation of these very powerful Italian syndicates that are sort of connected vaguely, but are really the result of power accumulated in America by ethnic Italians, Southern Italian. You probably will see that in India in the next coming decades. You'll see the rise of Indian Americans, as they're thought of, who go back to India and really flex their muscles. They have a lot of political power because they've employed a lot of Indians. They have a lot of money that they've made in the United States. They have American political power to back them up, the State Department, whatever. And, guys like Modi, who are like, thoroughbred native Indians, I don't even think that guy speaks a lot of English, will be replaced by high caste, maybe even mixed race, basically re-emigres who come back and they speak perfect English. They maybe speak multiple languages. Yeah. And they're able to really capture power, whether behind the scenes or in front of the scenes in India for whatever reason. And this cycle will repeat itself. Now, like in the US, a lot of the Italian syndicates were busted pretty thoroughly, but they were mostly engaged in activity that was far easier to disrupt from a legal standpoint. Now what we're seeing is corporate infiltration, which is not really easy to disrupt. It's very hard to target. It's very hard to prove. There has to be a lot of legal discovery. So a lot of these like employment proceedings and a lot of these lawsuits, I think, are kind of stymied because it's very difficult to prove that there's ethnic nepotism. When you can always say, "Oh, it was for cost saving," which is very hard to say no to. It's very hard to say, "No, you didn't do it for cost saving." Well, how do you know? I did it. We saved $400,000 by going to H-1Bs and outsourcing. We don't have to pay healthcare and all this stuff. And so it's very hard for you to say that's not true. And it just so happens we chose an Indian firm. And it just so happens that we chose guys here who speak Hindi, or they speak Tamil Nadu, like for what, so they can talk to the people back in India. Like, you can't say that any of that's illegal. You can't say I did anything wrong, that I violated any federal employment practices. And so that's why I think it's going to be very difficult to get over this. And there's really all you can do is stop the visa program and hope that limits their power to an extent. But like that article kind of points out, I think the cat's out of the bag. And they've really already ingratiated themselves into the elite. And they've already ingratiated themselves into Silicon Valley and the head product managers. And I think CEOs of several major corporations.
Yeah, they're already in our elite. I mean, their main goal is to join and take over our elite. And they're already started doing that in the UK. Like the UK shows what happens when you have a South Asian cast as like your new leaders. I mean, when Boris Johnson got sick and had to be hospitalized for COVID, 2 of his possible replacements were South Asian. and South Asian leaders are prominent in both the Labor and Conservative Party. And there's far more, when you turn on the TV, there's far more TV hosts and entertainers and comedians and general political commentators who are South Asian. And that looks like our future 10 years from now. You'll see more Kamil Nujanis and others of the sort. I mean, Indians are also trying to take over the political infrastructure and, ideological structure of the conservatives and the Republicans and Democrats. They're big in conservative media. They're big in liberal media. They're playing both sides of the field, even though they overwhelmingly support the Democrats. As the article pointed out, only 16% of Indians voted for Trump. And they're very eager to bring more Indians here. And so is India itself. The number one issue for the Indian lobby is passing this horrible bill called the Fairness for High Skilled Immigrants Act, which would give over 90% of professional employment-based visas to Indians over the next 10 years. Like,
well, they frame it as reducing the quota system, because this country does have a quota system. Like, we were only going to take so much of people.
Well, it's trapped in the country caps. And the country caps right now, only 7% of the allotted visas can go to one country. and there's a gigantic backlog of Indians. And they're like, well, we want to be fair to them and clear out the backlog, but you're going to have all these Indians coming here and taking middle-class jobs if that happens. But it serves the Indian interests to do that. And I think one of the things that even in my personal experience of seeing Indian nepotism is I, of course, worked for an Indian at the Daily Caller, Neil Patel, and he was very eager to hire Indians. It didn't matter like their qualifications. It's like, oh, you're Indian? It's like, where are you from? What's your family's caste? Like that would be the only questions, and that person would get in, even if their immigrant status is a little iffy or if they had like some, questionable background, they would get in. They would defend them in a way that he wouldn't necessarily defend his other employees. And Neil Patel sits on the board of the main Indian lobby group for the Fairness for High Skilled Immigrants Act. He sits on the board of Immigration Voice, which is a firm advocate for this bill, and is calling Rick Scott a Klansman for blocking the bill. And this is just showing him demonstrating his ethnic nepotism. And it's a group that you don't really know how to counter, because you can't be like, well, these Indians are just hiring each other and they're congregating with each other and trying to build up their own power. People are going to call you racist. Indians have fully weaponized the left's racial discourse and used it to advance their own interests. Much better than any other group there is. That's why they're in many of these powerful positions, is that they can claim that, like, I'm a brown person and thus I'm oppressed. Like the elevation of brown as a category in America, which it doesn't really exist. Who is brown? It's like a Mexican is brown, and so is a Pakistani, and so is like a Persian. Like none of these groups have anything in common, but it's a way of claiming victim status and putting them on the equal oppression, equal status of oppression as blacks. By saying black and brown bodies, they put themselves as equals to blacks, and they get as many rewards and benefits as being black. Because they're like, well, I suffer discrimination as a brown person. It's like, bro, you grew up in you lived in a $500,000 house, and your parents are doctors. Like you didn't suffer any oppression.
Well, yeah, I think that there's Kamala Harris, to me, really epitomizes this new trend of like these vaguely colored folk are all going to join in a coalition, and the whole point of it is to basically self-fulfill certain ideas about how much money they ought to make and how, what share of the pie they ought to have for both historical, they cite various historical reasons and current ones. So it's like this full frontal attack on the entire chronology of your time with them. And I think as a lot of, there's more and more kind of ethnic mixing in America, and there's a lot of, like, especially the lower classes are doing that more. There will be sort of a different take on the whole colored folk struggle. And Kamala really, I think, is the best representative of it. I don't think they're going to win in November, but I do think she's going to be around for a while. And she will increasingly come to be the Messiah or something like it, politically speaking, for these people, and that she is both half Indian, half Caribbean, black, and very vague ethnic mix. I have no really clue what she is. If you just look at her, she could be from 40 different countries that have.
And she changes her identity depending on audience. She highlights herself as Indian.
Yeah.
I mean, she really is Indian. She's not really black. I mean, by her cultural background, I mean, dad wasn't really around her. Dad doesn't even like her. She was raised by her mom's family. Her first name is Indian. Once again, showing that they love giving their children Indian names. Even they don't really assimilate but it's like giving their children a Kamala, even though I guess or Kamala rather, even though the dad, I guess, doesn't really have a decision in there. She's more culturally Indian than she's culturally black. And that's why a lot of blacks were like, you ain't really black to her. But now that question, if you make that question, you're a racist. So you can't say that. Yeah, she is definitely emblematic of this new Indian elite that we're going to have.
Well, I think it's not even just Indian elite. I think it is the vague colored elite.
Which is primarily going to be made up of South Asians. I mean,
yes,
East Asians don't really know how to move around the left's woke ideology. Like, I think even I've talked about this before, I believe, is like the Chinese, like they don't know how to appeal to the left to elevate China's causes. They haven't really figured that out yet. Once they do, it's game over for America. But and even East Asian immigrants here, most of them just feel white. And also when they try to claim that they're discriminated against, people are like, that's not really true. And they can't claim themselves as brown either. And they're not going to call themselves yellow. So they don't really have as much of a claim to serious discrimination as other groups. So they don't really know how to move around this. And I think they just mostly want to assimilate and, make money and whatever. But South Asians seem much more eager for power and to change the culture in a way that benefits them. And they're far more clannish, at least in my experience, than Chinese and Korean immigrants. So that gives them an additional benefit. And also blacks don't have the type of leadership class that they had before. They're always having to be led by other groups or people who are debatably black, like Barack Obama and Kamala Harris. And these are their new leaders. It's a half Kenyan guy raised by white parents and a half Jamaican, half Indian woman who was raised by an Indian family.
Well,
it's not necessarily authentically black.
They always cite Steve Jobs as like, why? Remember when the Syrian crisis was more at the front of people's minds, and they'd always say, like,
they always said that, like, this is a Syrian immigrant. Right. All Syrian immigrants are just like Steve Jobs.
He was half white and raised by like white Calvinists.
Yeah, and it's like in most Syrians, like that come here, they like people just think they're Italian. Like people aren't going to be like, "Oh, you're a brown person." It's like, no, they're just like, "Oh, I thought you're Italian." They're like, "No, I'm a Syrian Christian." That's like the thing.
Yeah.
And it's the same with look at all their groups. Like Hispanics seem to be moving to the right, not to the left, because I don't think they're being denied the opportunities to move into the upper class. So they're not going to serve as the lead. I think the real leadership is going to be coming from South Asians of this new leadership class we're going to have. And they're going to be people like Kamala Harris. They're going to be like the former chief of staff for AOC, who I'm not even going to try to pronounce his name. And these are the type of people we're going to be leading, and they're going to be leading both parties. We're going to see a similar situation that we're seeing in the UK that we're going to see here in the next 10 years and it should be interesting. They'll definitely be advocating for more Indian immigration, but to move along onto a different subject, a more lighthearted subject, you may say, is the Daily Wire had some really big news this week. They are leaving California to protest the big government policies, and they're moving to Nashville, just like every other basic white person who wants to move from California. They're either choosing Texas or they're choosing Nashville. There's a couple different things happening here. Is that you're seeing, a lot of people moving from these big states, and they're moving to the South. And a lot of conservatives celebrate this as a good thing. It's like, welcome, man. The taxes are low here and we're friendly. And then they come and they turn the city into places that they fled from. Not that Daily Wire is going to do that, even though they're goofy, but it does indicate a larger trend of what's happening to a lot of these southern cities. Do you see that there's going to be a more fleeing from California and from New York to the Sunbelt, even though Tennessee's debate?
I mean, it's already been going on. Out of Central California, there was a big, more corporate and enterprise emigration starting 10, 15 years ago, mainly due to restrictions on like the oil and gas sector and the agricultural sector out in Central California. And there were a lot of small companies that are, fulfill various roles in that wider supply chain who were leaving. And if you ever, heard about where they were leaving to, it was always North Carolina, Tennessee, Kentucky, Georgia,
Texas,
and right. There's been a huge deluge of Hollywood production that's moved to Georgia, to North Carolina, due to tax reasons. I think that you will see that more and more. You will see people from New England, from New York, from the West Coast go into the Sun Belt, go into Texas. Even to the very deep South, Alabama, Mississippi, and they will be there primarily for economic reasons. And that's mostly due to the fact that I think the traditional areas where people from these states would have hit first trying to leave have already kind of been filled up. So the first place that a lot of New Yorkers have been trying to go, especially during this pandemic, have been Rhode Island, Connecticut, and New Hampshire, and maybe Vermont to a small extent. But really, like Rhode Island and Connecticut have just been swamped. And there's horror stories from Connecticutonians. I think someone told me once they're called nutmeggers. But people from Connecticut and Rhode Islanders, saying like, hey, I was going to buy a house this year, and the local housing prices have gone up $60,000, $70,000 in 2 months. And it's just due to New Yorkers coming in, buying the house with cash, and immediately moving in. And so now that because these areas have been so filled up and the property values are too high, I think that they'll move to Louisville, Kentucky. They'll go to Atlanta, Georgia. They'll go to St. Louis, Missouri. They'll go to Nashville. They'll even go into that kind of mixed region between South and Midwest. I think Indiana is a good example of that. Indianapolis has seen a big kind of influx of these people. And it will be some conservative types, obviously, that'll do it for ideological reasons, or I think it'll generate a news cycle for 2 weeks, which is what they really want. But it's mostly emblematic of the fact that these conservative types who are doing this are really no different from the probably more woke center left to far left types who are metropolitan types who are leaving these cities because they're collapsing, leaving these states because they're collapsing, and going to areas that have a much more scaled down way of life to take advantage of it. And so I think it really shows that these people, Ben Shapiro is no different from the Wall Street bankers who are going down to Raleigh-Durham to pay less taxes and to have a bigger house than they already have in Rhode Island or Connecticut.
Yeah, and the people in North Carolina, especially, this is a less of a problem in Tennessee, is that they come and then they vote for the same policies.
Oh yeah, North Carolina's going to be.
North Carolina has like a significant problem with the Raleigh-Durham area going totally left wing, and these people keep moving there. It's like, well, you're moving there because of conservative policies that you're voting against, and in some ways it's happening in Nashville. Nashville isn't as bad as other states. It's one of the whiter cities in the South. It has always had a moderate Democrat leadership. They tried a goofy awful a few years ago who wanted to support Black Lives Matter and have all these progressive
with
changes.
Her bodyguard?
Yeah, she slept with her police bodyguard and lied about unused state funds for it. So it was a very awful moment. Typical awful moves going around. And she was not attractive in the least bit. She was a very pudgy woman in her 50s. So it's a gross story all around. But now they've replaced it with another moderate Democrat who just cares about business, and that keeps the people coming in. But Nashville's character has changed. It's all these people who move there, and then they immediately overnight they decide they're Southern, and they can dictate what Southern identity is. They can demand people knock down statues. They can demand that nobody flies the Confederate flag. That we're not going to honor. We're even going to challenge Andrew Jackson's legacy. This is the new Nashville identity. It really negates Southern identity and just makes it into saying y'all and folks, and I'm apparently nicer and I'm hospitable, and I just want everyone to love each other. It's like Dolly Parton. They want to become like she loves gays and blacks and everyone just coming together and making money and being loving together. It's like, it doesn't matter who you sleep with as long as you're nice. And that's the new Southern identity. It's like we're knocking over what the things that inspired Southerners for generations. Now that's gone. It's being replaced by these horrible California transplants who are moving to Nashville. And, I grew up in the Nashville area, and it radically changed even when I was there. And even the change has gotten significantly more than then. I mean, we didn't have major entertainment figures there moving to Nashville. Even people like Dave Mustaine of Megadeth fame has moved to my home county, which And when I was in high school, I thought that would have been the coolest thing ever. But he moved, of course, when I left. And there's so many others who are just moving there as like, this is the new place to be. But it undermines its traditional character, and the South just becomes a tax haven for Northerners to come, and they eliminate all the traces of genuine Southern identity that they come in contact with.
Well, it's similar to Austin in that respect. I think that there's obviously been
probably not as far along as
not
Austin,
as far along, right?
That.
But it's the process is the same. I mean, I was listening to the Ron White interview with Joe Rogan, who recently moved to Austin, actually, and he was kind of recounting the history of Austin. You know, how it got weird, and it really started in the '60s and '70s, and it was a lot of people coming in, you know, and they were taking advantage of very, very low cost of living back in the '60s and '70s, and taking advantage of sort of that it's kind of a wide open space. There's plenty of opportunity, plenty of businesses to start. There's a lot of unfulfilled supply for a lot of growing demand, that sort of thing. And really, I think that the Sunbelt process is the result of that kind of Bush family and Upper East Coast infusion into the South. I think people really regard the Bush family as Texans when they're really not. They're from Connecticut, and
W did. To interject, W did become an assimilated Texan, but no one else in the family did. I mean, Jeb, even though he moved to Florida, was still a dorky wasp, even though he's now Catholic. And George H.W. Bush never became like an authentic Texan, but W did by becoming a dumb frat boy who then transitioned into a born-again Christian who had the accent.
Yeah, but this process, the Sunbelt idea, really became out of the 50s and 60s, the post-war era. And I think a lot of it was due at the time to there was increasing discussions in the 60s about the new geography of production. And of course, this was the beginnings of outsourcing to East Asia, textile manufacturing, and things like that. I have a great book called Course of Industrial Decline, and it talks about the death of the New England textile mills, really going into the mid-50s. And this was part of it. You know, they were transitioning into the South, into the Sun Belt, and they were transitioning overseas very slowly. And the Sunbelt idea was like, how do we reframe what Southern identity is going forward? Southern identity is all about freedom and all about enterprise and all about making money. And as you can see that with like the show Dallas in the 80s. And instead of
Dallas was Atlanta rather was one of the few first cities to really embrace that the new South identity. It was like the city that's too busy to hate, as it always proclaimed itself. It was just too focused on business to defend its way of life.
Yeah, and so it was this very strange infusion of sort of the free market ideology that became very popular post-50s GOP, post-Robert Taft GOP. And the place that they seemed to have the most success pitching it, for whatever reason, really, was the South and this idea of the Sun Belt. And they saw it, I think, as the perfect opportunity because the labor costs are lower. There's less demand for certain services, less of an appreciation for unions. There's a lot of open land that has not been developed yet, so it'll be there's no landlords for some of it. Even a lot of it's just like owned by the state, and you had all these private developers buying it for pennies off of the state and turning it into multi-million-dollar factories overnight. And this process really kicked off in the 60s. And so I feel like the Austin, keep Austin weird, and the growing sort of metro infusion into southern cities like Nashville is really just a part of this ongoing process. Part of the process is, I think, making the South less distinct. It's about recreating Southern identity. Nikki Haley is a good example of that. And it's about turning Southern identity into something that's really more ephemeral and more of a brand rather than something concrete and something a little bit deeper with a higher historical resonance. And part of that agenda, too, is attacking the history of the South. So saying the new South is about fighting what the old South was. And part of that is being, not only open to business, but being open to people coming in, to new identities, to new ways of life. But as long as you keep saying y'all and you have a nice Southern twang, it's all kosher. And I think that this is part of a larger process of really, I'm not a Southerner, so I don't really have a stake in it, but bringing the South into the fold and really eliminating what I think is one of the most, probably the most thoroughly unique regions of the country, most distinct regions of the country would be the American South, from North Carolina to Texas, everywhere in between, and part of Florida even, and sort of taking that and saying that's no longer distinct in the way you want it to be distinct. It'll be distinct merely as a brand, similar to Keep Austin Weird. It has no real meaning and has no concept of the history of the region or the place, but it is something you can embrace safely without being criticized too much.
Yeah, exactly. And we actually have a story that it sort of shows off the New South and how its mentality is very different. There was a very brutal Nashville murder this week where a black man kidnapped a young couple, forced them to drive him around. He executed the young man in the car right before the eyes of his pregnant wife. The pregnant wife fortunately survived, and the man killed himself while in a gun battle with police. So this is like a very horrifying story. And people always say oh, the South is so white supremacist. It's so dangerous for black people there. They just can't walk around. And yet there's this story and the black guy who's the criminal in the story is a really, it almost looks like a Uruk-hai from the Lord of the Rings. This guy was a total thug in all the true sense of the word. And this guy was able to just murder people. I think he killed somebody before kidnapping the couple, and he murdered this guy right before the eyes of the young wife. It's a horrible crime. And people, if the liberal imagination of the South thinks that the South would just gather up a lynch mob to go kill this guy's family. And there's not any sense of outrage. Is that there was a candlelight vigil for the family, and the wife comes out. She's dealing with tremendous grief, and she's saying that my husband would have prayed for the criminal. And in some ways, she had a weird statement saying that implied that her murdered husband was praying for the killer. And there was this message of forgiveness and overcoming. And it's very different from the liberal imagination of how the South is. I don't necessarily think this is good, because we see this time and time again when there's a horrible, senseless murder, black on white murder. And the whites just say, well, we just have to forgive. We just have to move on. And the way it's treated is like a natural disaster. Is the news coverage of this ordeal for the married family is like a tornado came through their house and killed the husband, when it was another human being who kidnapped them for no good reason, just for total criminality, and shot him, no purpose, just out of pure sadism. And we're just supposed to treat it like it's just something that happens in America. You just have to live with it and move on, which is very different from we've seen the moral outrage when there's a career criminal who happens to die or get injured at the hands of police, that this is the worst atrocity to ever happen in U.S. history. And we all have to destroy our cities to have serious change. But when you could just be enjoying your life, being a model citizen, and have some criminal who looks like he's a Uruk-hai extra from the Lord of the Rings kidnap you at gunpoint and execute you and nearly kill your wife in a car chase with police, well, that's just like a tornado. That's a natural disaster. It just happens. We saw that even with the Cannon Hinnett case, where this young boy was murdered point blank by his black neighbor. And the family dealing with grief, I don't even know if they really have a response. It's just well, we want everyone to come together and love each other. And it's this is the complete opposite response. It's just you're treating this like your son got killed by an animal, or something that you couldn't have prevented. And you're just supposed to get on with it. The worst case of this ever was the Molly Tibbetts case, where a young college student in Iowa was murdered by an illegal immigrant in 2018. And her family basically came out in support of the killer. They got mad at anyone who proposed policy changes. They're no, we cannot blame immigrants. We want more immigrants. Their food is so delicious. I'm checking my white privilege. And it's like, your daughter just got murdered. There was a really heinous Washington Post article where the mother of Molly Tibbetts adopted a friend of the killer. And the friend's killer convinced the mom to sympathize with the killer. And the Washington Post is like, bravo, we love this. And it's like, your solution to this is total, just like ignore what happened and have a magnanimous spirit that is never seen in any of these police involved killings of blacks or any white on black involved killing. And you're just supposed to get over it and forgive and hope that they get the lightest sentence possible. As we even saw in, last year, there was a white man who was beaten to death by black teenagers at a Maryland fair. The family asked for lenient charges for one of the killers. You're just like, it's just like supposed to accept and forgive and just act like it's a natural disaster happening to you.
Well, I think that part of it might be instinctual. Part of it's brainwashing, but part of it's instinctual. And I think that, in private, you're probably grieving and, you do what most people do. You really...
Yeah, we don't want to be, to put an extra point, we don't want to be too hard on some of these families. Molly Tibbetts' family, with the exception, because they went into a direction that was far more than acceptable. Like, this young wife, her husband, the man of her life, just died. She doesn't know how to cope with it. Same with the family, Ken Hennett's family. They don't know how to deal with this whole thing. And they're just trying to handle as best as they can. We don't necessarily want to insult them, but it's how society treats it and celebrates them for just like giving forgiveness. That's really what we're focusing on.
Yeah, I'm not blaming them, and that's why I'm saying it. Part of it's just brainwashing. I think a lot of these people have been brainwashed and they don't know any better. And, another aspect of it is probably that they instinctually know or instinctually feel that if they play this game where they talk about forgiveness, maybe they will actually see justice. And instead of being hardcore and saying, I hope they give them the needle tomorrow, which is what I think a lot of people feel in those scenarios, it's harder and harder to come out and say that because we have a culture in this country that is anti-death penalty, which I think is really strange. I think that should be on the table for a lot more offenses nowadays. And we also have a culture that is, again, all about rationalizing things. When you come to the point where you say anything can be rationalized, we can look at the causality of how it happened. Suddenly the punishment aspect becomes less and less important. And so you have people somewhat cynically, but also I think some of them earnestly coming out and trying to rationalize what happened. Why was my daughter killed? Why was my husband killed? What did I do to lead it to this? Because they've been taught and brainwashed to try and rationalize things. Instead of just saying murder on the face of it is wrong, and we've been teaching that it's wrong for a very long time, and it used to be punished much more harshly to get the message across that nothing really, very few things can really rationalize murder. And I think that now as we rationalize everything and we try and look at the causes, we talk about intersectionality, we talk about the history of oppression that's leading to violence, and we talk about poverty leading to violence. Now you can see, okay, it's never that person's fault. It's always the fault of a wider system. The system killed my daughter, not that guy killed my daughter. And it's very easy to see yourself as part of the system, especially, I guess, if you're white and you're one of these people and you're browbeat and you're brainwashed every day that you are part of the systemic racism. You are part of the system of racism that made this possible. And
you can't have the type of moral condemnation for the black or the non-white killers that you would with a white killer. Like, I learned this, one of my, first red pill moments in, I had freshman sociology class. We learned about this story. There was this downtrodden, poor black guy who decided to kidnap a white woman, and he originally intended just to rob her, and then he kept raping her, and then like he drove her around, and then he decided to kill her, and then like, this is a horrifying crime. This guy is a scumbag. He should be like taken, like you should get the death penalty, like firing squad immediately. Like this guy's total shitbird. And then the thing was like, but his conditions were so bad. And it was asking us to sympathize with this horrible criminal. And it's like, he didn't know better. He just had to keep raping her. And then he had to kill her. He just didn't know what to do in this situation. You have to look at the conditions. And white people are indoctrinated into this thinking that we always have to look at the conditions. It's like, what made this illegal immigrant, what in his life made him kill my daughter? I should really learn about this and try to reach an understanding with him.
And America was a radically different place on these kinds of things, even just 30, 40 years ago. I mean,
yeah, even the South, like if this happened in 1950s Nashville, very different reaction would have happened. You know,
I'm thinking
not
of
necessarily saying that's necessarily better, but there would be like that old like vengeance of the South, which was animated by these lynch mobs, which, you know, we obviously support the legal justice system handling this, but in the South, there was this like, we have to take care of it ourselves. Like, this crime is so outrageous, we can't leave it to the law, and our community is going to come together and do something about it. That old South is long gone. It's dead, as you can see in this. And even in the reaction to Nashville, which was always a more moderate city than the rest of the South, that same situation you could see in even like rural Alabama.
Yeah, I mean, I'm thinking, speaking of the Bush family, I'm thinking of in 88 or 87, 88, when Bush was running against Dukakis. And the, you know, like the 1-2 punch that really destroyed Dukakis was this issue of prison reform that I remember Dukakis was supporting. And Bush Sr. had this amazing ad where he talked about a prisoner who was let out on a weekend pass, who went out and murdered a bunch of people.
Well, Willie, he didn't necessarily murder. It was similar to this young couple. He targeted a young couple. He broke into their home and tortured them and raped the wife.
Tortured them. Okay.
He nearly killed him. He nearly killed the husband, but he didn't necessarily murder. We gotta be fact check here. But
okay, so I was wrong on that. But
anyway, that couple was like demanding justice. They were not being like, we forgive the guy who raped my wife and like nearly killed me with a knife and kept torturing me. Like, I want to understand Willie Horton's situation that made him do these terrible things to us, which would have been the reception now. This white couple was out there publicly and be like, we want tougher crimes. Like, what the horrible things happen to us, we want to prevent that from happening to other people, and we demand justice. We want the worst thing to happen to Willie Horton, which is a natural human response, in which it is not bad. That's a natural response, and you want to protect other people. The horrible thing that happened to you, you want to protect others from that. You would never see that today. If somebody was like the victim of that kind of crime, if they were demanding the type of vengeance and tough crime policies that they said, they've been ignored, and everyone would call them a racist, that they just need to understand the situation. And that, like, this is a natural disaster that you just need insurance for, as they always like to say, but you have insurance. It's like, it's okay if some guy, you know, if you had suffered a terrible home invasion where your wife was raped, you have insurance. All that can be replaced. It's okay. You just need to overcome it. Unless that guy is white and the victims are non-white, very different reaction there. Well, but if you're a white person and suffering at the hands of non-white criminality, you just need to get over it and have insurance.
I think it's interesting to consider, what if remember the Virginia Tech shooter? And that was early mid 2000s. Yep. What if that happened today, in today's climate? Like, how would that be perceived? Would there be immediate stories about, one person says off the record that he was a victim of anti-Asian racism frequently, and that's why he did what he did. And they would try and really rationalize it and get into his mind why he went fucking psycho and shot up a cloud.
And I think most of his victims were white. They would definitely have that. They would definitely have that scenario today.
Yeah.
If that occurred, or they would try to ignore it. There was, a brief time in the mid 2000s where not everything was racially influenced. But now today, you would definitely see that. And it's unfortunate, but we do need to break whites out of this mindset that they just need to accept this stuff. This stuff is not acceptable. They need to look for serious policy solutions. And there should be the reaction that Willie Horton's victims had today, that people need to react in the same way, that they want serious solutions. They want tough on crime policies to ensure that the horrible things that happen to them never happen to other people, and that's what Black Lives Matter is doing, even though in all these cases, it seems like the victim may have deserved what happened to them, or the supposed victim, or there was no crime at all that occurred. We can use the vengeance mindset with George Floyd and Jacob Blake, but we can't use it in the situation of this young Nashville couple. And once whites get over what they're expected to do, I mean, the media tells them that they need to forgive, and if they want to be a good person, they just have to look over it and hope for the best in the future. Because the media lionized the Tibbetts family for basically accepting their daughter's murder and saying that their killer is not a bad guy, and we need more immigrants in response to this, because the real crime is Donald Trump highlighting this case.
Well,
we need to overcome this mindset.
It's all about selectively hijacking, the traditional American Christian mindset.
Absolutely,
and
yes.
So they don't do it when they're talking about something like Cuties. They will do it when they're talking about something like forgiving and forgetting crimes of murder. And it's very, very peculiar that they will choose violence as the thing that like hardcore physical violence, even death, morbid violence, as the thing that you need to be forgiving about. And that you need to invoke your Christian mentality, and you need to look at the long, beautiful history of turning the other cheek. The meek shall inherit the earth. And then also selectively say, but we don't need that Christian morality anymore. We're so close-minded. Why would you think that when you're talking about child exploitation, something like Cuties, something like the recent sexual mores that have been sort of unleashed on the country? And it's this game that's very, very grotesquely played against normal working people who I think have an internal revulsion towards both murder and like torturing and murdering someone out of just pure bloodlust or for monetary reasons, which is what a lot of this is. And also something like Cuties. It's about trying to reach those people who are now internally harboring that stuff because they're scared to talk about it publicly, and trying to hijack their senses about what they need to be concerned with and how they ought to be concerned with it and what they shouldn't be concerned with. And as long as they keep playing up certain aspects of the Christian thing, they can, I think, prevent the realization amongst a lot of people that, fundamentally this media enterprise and the wider cultural enterprise is very anti-Christian at its core. And and
they really just weaponize Christianity for the sole purposes of forgiving non-white criminality and wanting more immigrants here, and also, I guess, single-payer healthcare. Those are the only three things that apparently Jesus Christ taught. And that's it. And that's modern day Christianity. It unfortunately has a lot of power in our society, and the left knows how to weaponize and manipulate it. And that's just something that people really need, and it's a very powerful tool over white Americans, and they need to learn to overcome it and feel that it's necessary to want to have policy solutions, that you shouldn't accept the new normal. You shouldn't accept these terrible things that happen to you. There are actual solutions to this. There are policy solutions that you should advocate for. That is all the points that I wanted to make on that subject. I want to move on. Before I get on to reader questions, there's a point that I really want to emphasize that comes from our good friend, Nick Fuentes, who, of course, been a highly respected guest. Some of you may have heard of him, of course. He made an excellent point on Telegram this week that I really want to emphasize. And we see a ton of black pill posts on Twitter. People are like, oh, everything's gone. Burger King has fallen, when they'll see a new ad, or they'll just everyone just always black pill. They always want to see the worst and everything and be pessimistic. Nick pushed back against that this week. And I want to read this quote in full. So he said, quote, "Negativity is poison for an insurgent political movement. We should be realistic about our chances of succeeding and what we're up against, but constant negativity only serves to demoralize," unquote. Nick added that we need to provide positive messages and point out victories so people don't slip into total doomer mode. He said out of this outlook, "I'd prefer to look at Trump's re-embrace of populism, the historic rise of Tucker Carlson, new projects like Revolver News, establishment figures like Kirk or Walsh pivoting to our worldview. The list goes on and on. We are inevitable. Do not listen to haters and doubters." And to even add another point is we have Lauren Witzka, who is now the GOP nominee in Delaware, and she has a total America First platform, supports the moratorium, retweets grapers, and I think she follows me. So I'm influencing a Senate candidate, I guess. And so she's articulating our point of view, and she is the party's nominee in a state. Now, not likely she's going to win, but it doesn't matter in the case. It's like becoming the Senate, a major party Senate nominee is a win in of itself. And this shows that our ideas matter. They're getting much greater attention than they were just 4 or 5 years ago. As somebody who was like very involved in politics in the pre-Trump era, nobody gave a shit about our ideas. We did not have candidates becoming Senate nominees anywhere on our platform. And now we are. People care about our message. People are listening. As you can see, Tucker Carlson's the highest rated cable news show on the planet, and he articulates our message on a daily basis. So, we shouldn't be too pessimistic. And I was even having a friendly debate with Pedro Gonzalez, who does great work at American Greatness. Sometimes he's a little too negative, saying that like, oh, of course, Trump's going to pass amnesty. Not much evidence for that, and we should always be on the lookout and to criticize that if he does. But we shouldn't look at the worst of everything. We need to keep a bright, optimistic viewpoint. We are gaining strength. Yes, we have setbacks. Yes, we have challenges. That's what happens when you're a serious movement. When the elites see you as a threat, they're going to come down hard on you. The fact that we're having strong challenges is an indication that we matter, that we're gaining strength, and they fear us. So just something to always keep in mind. Don't slip into doomer mode. Listen to Nick's points. Keep a positive, happy attitude, and don't OD on black pills. So Hans, what do you think about that?
Yeah, don't sit around and basically talk about how black-pilled you are and how you want to like blow your head off. That doesn't really get you anywhere. And while things are actually always much worse than you probably initially understand, humankind has survived far, far worse. And my old friend Ryan Landry used to say, just remember that your ancestors survived the Ice Age. If you're here now, it's because they survived at least one Ice Age. And if they can survive that, I think that you can survive whatever's going on now, and you can maybe even thrive in it. So it's
true. Your ancestors survived the sinking of Atlantis. Somehow they made it. They swam to Europe from Atlantis. So just think about that. When next time you're doomer pilled.
Yeah, your ancestors survived and saw things that you can only imagine having seen. This week's myth talked about kind of the history of the wildfires on the West Coast, and found an amazing study that annually, in prehistory, there's some record of millions upon millions upon millions of acres of forest burning every single year in the West Coast, even when it was populated with humans. And so you can imagine if you think it's bad now, a literal hellscape annually, and people still lived through that. People still figured out ways to fight and to make a middling existence, but an existence nonetheless. So I think that regardless of how bad things are now, there have been times when they've been far, far worse, far more destructive, and people have managed to do okay. So don't despair too much. Always know that the system that's in place now won't last. And whether or not you have something to do with it not lasting is irrelevant. It won't last. And so while you might kind of have to suffer under it, there's always the possibility that if you hang tight, keep your head down, play it cool. Your grandkids can have a much nicer future than you do now.
Absolutely. Couldn't say it better myself. So now we'll move on to the reader questions. Just as a reminder, as I say every week, you too can get the power to ask me questions on Highly Respected if you sign up for the patron option at Highly Respected's Patreon. This week's question comes from B-Man. He asks, quote, Trump's Hispanic support is going up. How does he make the most of this? This is actually a funny thing is that the man who called Mexicans they're bringing drugs, they're bringing crime, they're racist, or rapists rather, but some I assume are good people. Apparently the some who are good people are now moving to Trump's column. There was one poll this week that showed him with 41% of Hispanic support. In 2016, I think he only had 29% Hispanic support. And pretty much every poll is showing him with at least 35% Hispanic support. This might not be enough for him to win the election because, his white vote percentage or white voters are as excited for Trump as apparently Hispanics are. So he can make the most of this. I think the one important thing to know about his high Hispanic support is that the GOP for years and years and years said the only way to win Hispanics is with promising them amnesty. Trump, we can talk about his immigration disappointments, has killed the idea for a comprehensive amnesty. He's always been resolutely opposed to amnesty. Yes, he wants to make a DACA deal in exchange for immigration restrictions. We all know about that. But the type of comprehensive amnesty that the GOP envisioned in 2012 and 2013 with the Gang of Eight amnesty, that is not a real possibility anymore. Trump has always opposed that. He does not want giving all illegal aliens here legal status. Doesn't show any sign of that. And he's always warned about immigration, wanted a strong border wall. Nobody has been a harder immigration hawk than Trump in the Republican Party since Dwight D. Eisenhower. That's just the fact of the matter. So whatever his faults, he is that. But yet, Hispanics are gravitating towards him. And a lot of it probably has to do with his law and order message, is that Hispanic communities are not fans of the riots, and they're also not fans of how the entire left's racial dynamic is just centering around black interests. Their interests are being ignored. There was a brilliant ad that the Trump campaign put out pointing out how the Democrats care more about blacks than them, which is true. And now Joe Biden's having to play Despacito because he's so desperate to win them over. So I think there's going to be a large-scale coalition. And I think Hispanics, a lot of them are sort of assimilating to whites culture.
Well, a lot of them are basically white. I mean, when you say Hispanic, it's like a whole
it depends on the ones.
Yeah, it's not like a single ethnic group. It's not like saying Polish. It's very, very different than that. And
Cubans are very different from Puerto Ricans. Mexicans are very different from Colombians. It's not a group that can be universalized into one ethnic identity.
Even their dialects of Spanish are often very different from one another. I've been told, I don't speak great Spanish, but I've been told that Argentines and Cubans, for example, have a difficult time understanding each other, or that Mexicans and Argentines or Mexicans and Venezuelans have a difficult time understanding each other. They have different vocabulary, accents. So to say Hispanic, I think, it's super broad. It's basically like saying white. And if you actually look at the real breakdown in there's plenty of Hispanics who are effectively white. They identify as Hispanic for cultural reasons or what have you. But they're assimilating, and they're really becoming part of the working and middle class.
Yeah, white working middle class. They're not assimilating to the upper class. I was mentioning this before. They're not the ones going to Columbia, and even they really don't have as sympathetic as an oppression narrative. And you don't really see Hispanics in the activist leadership. And they really don't like the other groups that they have to be a part of a coalition with. And I think they also don't have significant animus towards whites.
They're not going to college for things like gender studies. They're not trying to get a PhD. A lot of them, I met some nice guys who were Hispanic, who were mostly interested in mechanical engineering, petroleum engineering, electrical engineering. I met one who was interested in biochem, and when they go to college, a lot of them don't even go to do these like goofy Chicano studies or whatever. They are there for something more technical or something a bit more challenging. And it's really about being.
And they also come from more humble backgrounds than Indian immigrants. Like their parents are not doctors. Like they're the first one in their family going to college. Their dad is likely like a mechanic himself. He doesn't have much money to support their child going to college. They're probably more appreciative of the college experience. And they're also not going to, they're really going to just like a state school. And whites are not going to really like, they're probably going to try to fit in with the white students there, and they're going to become a Republican. And that's the story for them. I don't think they feel left out of the Grand Coalition. They know they're not going to get that many benefits. They don't really have the type of animus against whites. They don't really see the elite strategy that Asians are doing of like embracing like white privilege theory and anti-white, sentiment as like a way of boosting their own power. They don't really get the benefits of that. And also this mindset that like they want to advertise that Trump is a caudillo. I think they actually like the fact that Trump is a caudillo. They want a strong man in power who's going to knock down, who's going to bring law and order. And also their communities are the ones being affected by the greater criminality. Like
they're the ones with the small businesses who are being burned down. They're the ones who often have to do jobs in these neighborhoods that are becoming very dangerous to perform work.
Yeah, and they're the ones who, if they call the police aren't going to show up.
Yeah,
like they're seeing time. Like they're not the ones in this comfy suburbs who are seeing like that is insulated from all this. Like they're right next to
increasingly fulfilling the role, I think, in a lot of ways that the Irish and some of the Eastern Slavs used to fulfill, the Polish and so forth in some of these cities. They're the cops. They are the mechanics. They are the construction workers. They're the small business owners. They're the local city councilmen. They're maybe even a judge or two. And they fulfill those roles. And if you look at the breakdown of whites by heritage, I believe that it's actually really Slavs and Irish and Scots-Irish who are the most likely to vote for Trump, because they still predominantly, although there's plenty of more well-to-do people with mixed Irish or descent, maybe mixed Slavic descent, they're still the ones doing a lot of those jobs in their traditional cities. And so I think it speaks more to who Trump appeals to. Trump appeals to the working guy, to the guy who's small business owner, middle class, maybe has a college degree. He's just trying to make his way through life, just trying to keep his head down, trying to have a family. Trump really appeals to those people, I think, regardless of race. And it's maybe less about white assimilation, and it's more about, the real American working class assimilation, who's really having to bear the brunt of these riots, of these trade deals, and the immigration that's kind of gone out of control. Who has to really feel the pain every day? I think those are the people that end up voting for Trump, and Hispanics have decided, I think, to fall into that, and have decided that that's where they want to be in America. They want to be part of the middle class and part of the enterprising, sort of mass. And naturally, what Trump is promising, I think, fights for, appeals to them. So it's not altogether all that surprising. And I think it has less and less to do with race, and really just more about economic standing.
Yeah, and I think national populism is the way to win them over. And I think the way Trump can make the most of it is building a permanent or a new coalition for the GOP that unites working class and middle class whites with middle and working class Hispanics. And this is the way forward for the GOP, and it has to be national populistic in order to maintain this coalition. The old Paul Ryan agenda is not going to keep this coalition together, and it's a losing strategy. And I think if he wins in 2020 with 37, 38% Hispanic support and enough white support to get him over the hurdle, this is the future of the GOP. And the GOP needs to ditch the idea that Hispanics are natural conservatives, but they may be natural racists. So that is the way to go. But that is the final note I'm going to have to leave it on. We've We've had a very long, very fruitful discussion with Hans today, so I'm going to leave it to Hans. Hans, tell the good listeners how to follow you.
You can follow me through Myth of 20th Century. I think our episode will be going out today. And you can always follow us over at the American Sun. I think the American Sun was actually just retweeted by Lauren Witzka. So we guess we have that
big
in
moves
common.
in the world.
And yeah, you can follow me at one of those two places. And there's a lot of great content coming out of them. So make sure to stay tuned.
Awesome, man. Well, it's always great to have you, and we'll definitely see you again. Hopefully after Nightmare Vision returns from his forest hideaway. So we'll have to see. We mentioned him a lot this time, so maybe he got the message. But anyway, thanks for coming on, man.
Thank you for having me on, Scott.
You're welcome. And until next time, stay respected.